The ancient puzzle chamber deep beneath the Council's primary world hummed with energy that had been building for centuries, waiting for this moment when representatives from every corner of the galaxy would gather to face what many called the ultimate test of intelligence. Dr. Emily Watson adjusted her simple cloth uniform and looked around at the massive crystalline amphitheater where beings of impossible diversity had assembled. Creatures made of living gas floated beside mechanical entities that sparked with electric thought, while others appeared as pure geometric shapes that pulsed with colors beyond human perception. High Arbiter Quill stood at the center of the chamber, his translucent body refracting light into patterns that spoke directly to the minds of all present without need for words. He had overseen this ritual for over 2,000 years and had watched every species eventually bow their heads in defeat before the puzzle known throughout the galaxy as the Infinite Paradox. The holographic display materialized above them all, a swirling mass of mathematical equations, quantum probability matrices, and logical structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that defied basic understanding. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like staring into the face of a cosmic riddle that laughed at anyone who tried to comprehend it. Emily had studied the historical records during her journey to this world, reading about the greatest minds that had attempted this challenge over the millennia. The Centaurian Collective, with their shared consciousness spanning billions of individuals, the Silicon Lords whose computational power could simulate entire universes, the energy dancers who existed as pure thought and could process information at the speed of light itself. Each species had brought their most advanced technology and their greatest intellectuals to bear against this puzzle, and each had failed in spectacular fashion. Some had declared it unsolvable and walked away. Others had spent decades trying to crack its secrets only to admit defeat, and a few had suffered complete mental breakdowns when their logic systems couldn't handle the paradoxes contained within. The test wasn't just about solving the puzzle. It was about proving that your species deserved a place among the truly advanced civilizations of the galaxy. Those who succeeded would gain access to knowledge and technologies beyond imagination, while those who failed would forever be marked as intellectually inferior. Ambassador Roth drifted closer to Emily, his gaseous form shimmering with curiosity, as he examined the human with what might have been amusement. His species had evolved beyond physical bodies eons ago, and existed as pure consciousness within contained energy fields, making them natural mathematicians who could think in dimensions that solid beings couldn't even conceptualize. "Tell me, small flesh creature." Roth's voice resonated directly in Emily's mind through quantum entanglement. "What makes your primitive species believe they can succeed where we have failed? Your people have barely mastered faster-than-light travel and still require physical bodies to house your consciousness." Emily smiled politely and pulled out a worn notebook filled with handwritten equations and sketches, causing several nearby delegates to emit sounds that the universal translator interpreted as various forms of laughter. The sight of someone bringing paper and pen to challenge a puzzle that had stumped quantum supercomputers was apparently the funniest thing many of them had witnessed. The mechanical delegate from the Helix Confederation whirred and clicked as he processed this information through his crystalline neural networks. Query: does the human representative require technological assistance? Our portable quantum processors are available for species lacking adequate computational resources. You, but I think I'll manage with what I have, Emily replied, causing another wave of amused reactions throughout the chamber. She had expected this response. Humanity was still considered one of the newer and more primitive species in galactic society, having only achieved interstellar flight within the last few centuries. High Arbiter Quill's form pulsed with what might have been sympathy as he began the formal presentation of the challenge. The infinite paradox had been discovered in the ruins of an ancient civilization that had vanished before most current species had even evolved, left behind as either a gift or a curse for future generations to puzzle over. The puzzle itself defied easy description. It appeared to be a series of interconnected logical statements that seemed reasonable individually, but created impossible contradictions when considered together. Quantum mechanics suggested certain solutions that were immediately invalidated by temporal causality principles, while mathematical proofs led to conclusions that violated the basic laws of physics. Every attempt to solve one aspect of the puzzle caused three more impossibilities to emerge elsewhere in the structure. Like a hydra of logic that grew new heads faster than they could be severed, the most advanced artificial intelligences had burned out their processors trying to find a path through the contradictions, while organic minds had simply declared the entire thing a cosmic joke. Emily studied the display with growing fascination, not because she understood the complex mathematics involved, but because something about the pattern of failures seemed familiar to her. She had seen this type of behavior before, not in mathematical systems but in something far more commonplace. Frustrated people who were trying to get someone's attention. The other delegates began their formal attempts with great ceremony, bringing forth technological marvels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever created. The collective of Rigel activated a hive mind network spanning 17 star systems to bring their combined intelligence to bear on the problem, while the Silicon Lords interfaced directly with quantum computers the size of small moons, for hours. Emily watched as species after species applied their greatest intellectual resources to the puzzle, each approaching it from their own unique perspective, but all following the same basic assumption that this was a mathematical problem requiring a mathematical solution. The energy dancers performed intricate thought patterns that created visible distortions in space-time itself as they attempted to process the puzzle's contradictions through pure mental force, while the crystal entities resonated at frequencies that could unlock the secrets of atomic structure itself. Yet one by one, they began to admit defeat. Computational systems overheated and shut down, hive minds dissolved in confusion, and even the most advanced artificial intelligences simply stated, insufficient data for meaningful analysis. Before going silent, Emily continued making notes in her simple notebook, occasionally glancing up at the puzzle display but spending most of her time observing the failed attempts around her. She began to notice a pattern in how the puzzle responded to different approaches. It wasn't just randomly impossible. It seemed to be actively resisting solution in ways that suggested something more than mere mathematical complexity as the greatest minds in the galaxy exhausted themselves against the infinite paradox. Emily found herself growing increasingly irritated, not with the puzzle itself, but with its behavior. It reminded her of students she had known who pretended not to understand simple concepts just to get attention, or computer programs that threw error messages instead of admitting they didn't know what the user wanted. The more she watched, the more convinced she became that everyone was approaching this wrong. They were treating the puzzle as an intellectual challenge when it might actually be something else entirely. Silence filled the massive chamber as every species turned their full attention to the puzzle floating before them, their various forms of consciousness focusing like laser beams on the swirling mass of contradictions and impossibilities that had defied solution for 3,000 years. The hegemony representatives formed a perfect circle and began their synchronized thinking process, their minds linking together through quantum entanglement to create a collective intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions. Their shared consciousness hummed with mathematical precision as they processed millions of potential solutions simultaneously. Emily watched with genuine admiration as the various alien species deployed technologies and abilities that seemed like magic compared to human capabilities. The synthetics projected holographic workspaces that extended through folded space-time, allowing them to examine the puzzle from angles that didn't exist in normal reality. The gas giant collective's ambassador Roth expanded his consciousness to encompass several cubic kilometers of space, his thoughts moving at near light speed as he analyzed every quantum state and probability matrix within the puzzle's structure. His form shimmered and pulsed with colors that represented mathematical concepts humans didn't even have words for. Yet despite all this impressive display of intellectual firepower, Emily noticed something that troubled her. Every species was approaching the problem in essentially the same way, treating it as a purely logical construct that could be solved through superior processing power or more advanced mathematical frameworks. She pulled out her simple ballpoint pen and began sketching on a fresh page of her notebook, ignoring the sophisticated holographic displays and quantum processors surrounding her. The sound of pens scratching against paper seemed absurdly primitive in this environment, like someone trying to chop down a tree with a butter knife. Several delegates actually paused in their work to stare at her, their various sensory organs focusing on this bizarre sight of a human using what appeared to be ancient marking implements. The universal translator picked up fragments of conversation as beings discussed whether this was some sort of religious ritual or cultural eccentricity. Look how the primitive creature attempts to solve quantum paradoxes with pressed plant matter and colored liquids, whispered one of the crystal entities, its voice creating harmonic resonances that made the air itself sing with mathematical concepts. The mechanical delegate from Helix Confederation tilted his sensor array toward Emily with obvious confusion, his optical systems zooming in to analyze her simple notebook. Query: is the human representative experiencing malfunction? Shall we contact your species' technical support systems? Emily smiled and shook her head, continuing to scribble what looked like random doodles and disconnected thoughts. She wasn't trying to solve the mathematical aspects of the puzzle because she had realized something that all these advanced civilizations seemed to have missed. The puzzle wasn't behaving like a mathematical construct at all. While the other species attacked the problem with pure logic, Emily found herself treating it more like a conversation with a difficult person. She began responding to its contradictions not as flaws to be corrected, but as statements to be acknowledged and addressed. "You're not making sense on purpose, are you?" she muttered under her breath as she studied the puzzle's latest manifestation, watching how it shifted and changed in response to each failed solution attempt. The universal translator caught her words and broadcast them to the chamber, causing several delegates to emit sounds of confusion. The energy dancers paused in their complex thought patterns, their forms flickering with what might have been surprise at this unprecedented approach. Never before had anyone addressed the puzzle directly as if it were a conscious entity, rather than an abstract problem to be solved. Hours passed as the greatest minds in the galaxy continued their assault on the infinite paradox, each bringing increasingly sophisticated approaches to bear against its defenses. Quantum computers the size of asteroids burned out their processing cores while trying to calculate impossible probability matrices. The Centaurian Collective activated backup processing centers spanning 3 star systems, their hive mind growing to encompass billions of individual consciousnesses all focused on this single challenge. Their combined intellectual power could have redesigned entire solar systems or calculated the precise position of every atom in a galaxy-sized region. Yet the puzzle seemed to grow more complex and contradictory in response to each attempt, as if it were actively adapting its defenses to counter whatever approach was being used against it. Mathematical proofs that had seemed promising moments before would suddenly reveal fatal flaws that invalidated entire chains of reasoning. Emily continued her simple note-taking, occasionally looking up at the puzzle display with an expression that was less analytical curiosity and more personal annoyance. She had begun treating the floating mathematical construct like a stubborn student who was deliberately giving wrong answers just to be difficult. "Stop pretending you don't understand basic logic," she said quietly to herself, tapping her pen against the notebook in a rhythm that seemed to match the puzzle's own shifting patterns. Several nearby delegates turned their attention toward her, intrigued by this unusual behavior. The Silicon Lords deployed their most advanced analytical protocols, creating virtual universes where they could test millions of potential solutions without risking damage to their primary systems. Each simulation ran for subjective millennia in compressed time, exploring every possible approach to the puzzle's various components. Meanwhile, the crystal entities began resonating at frequencies that could unlock the fundamental constants of reality itself, their harmonic patterns creating visible distortions in the space around them as they attempted to vibrate the puzzle into revealing its secrets through pure sonic manipulation. One by one, however, these advanced approaches began to fail in spectacular fashion. The hegemony's synchronized consciousness fractured under the strain of processing too many contradictions simultaneously, forcing them to separate back into individual minds to prevent permanent damage to their collective intelligence. The giant collective's expansion reached its limits as Ambassador Roth encountered logical paradoxes that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of his consciousness. He contracted back to his normal size with visible reluctance, his form dim and flickering from the effort. Emily watched these failures with growing certainty that everyone was missing something fundamental about the nature of this challenge. While they focused on the mathematical complexity, She had become convinced that the real puzzle lay in understanding why it was behaving this way in the first place. She began addressing the display directly, speaking to it as if it were a person, rather than a collection of equations and quantum states. Her simple human approach seemed almost childlike compared to the sophisticated techniques being employed around her. "I know you're listening," she said softly, causing several delegates to pause their work and stare at her in amazement. The idea of talking to a mathematical construct was so alien to most species that they couldn't process what they were witnessing. The puzzle's display flickered slightly in response to her words, a change so subtle that the advanced sensors monitoring it barely registered the shift. But Emily noticed, and she smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had finally gotten a reaction from a difficult conversation partner. The Galactic Council's chamber had become a graveyard of failed intellectual ambitions as species. After species admitted defeat against the infinite paradox, their most advanced technologies and brilliant minds, proving inadequate against its seemingly impossible contradictions, Emily sat in her simple chair, surrounded by the wreckage of quantum computers and the exhausted forms of beings who had pushed their consciousness to its limits. Her notebook now contained pages of sketches and observations that looked more like doodles than serious mathematical work. The synthetics had finally shut down their holographic workspaces after their processing cores began showing signs of permanent damage from trying to calculate solutions to problems that violated the basic laws of logic. Their optical arrays dimmed as they entered protective standby mode. Ambassador Roth had contracted his gaseous form to its minimum stable configuration, his usual shimmering colors reduced to a dull gray that indicated severe mental fatigue. The mere effort of expanding his consciousness to encompass the puzzle's full complexity had nearly caused his energy matrix to collapse entirely. "This is unprecedented," High Arbiter Quill announced to the chamber, his crystalline form pulsing with patterns that conveyed both disappointment and fascination. "Never before have so many species attempted the puzzle simultaneously, yet the result remains the same. Complete failure across all approaches." Emily looked up from her notebook and glared at the puzzle display with genuine irritation, like someone who had been trying to have a reasonable conversation with an uncooperative person for far too long. Her patience had finally reached its limit. "You absolute piece of garbage logic trap," she muttered under her breath, but the chamber's universal translator system caught every word and broadcast it to all the assembled delegates. The sound of a human insulting a mathematical construct created a moment of stunned silence. Several representatives actually recoiled in shock at this unprecedented breach of protocol. Never in 3,000 years had anyone addressed the infinite paradox with anything resembling disrespect. Most species had treated it with the reverence due to an ancient mystery. The crystal entities ceased their harmonic resonances entirely, their forms going silent for the first time since the testing began. They had achieved perfect mathematical harmony with cosmic constants for millions of years, and had never encountered a being who would insult abstract concepts. Emily wasn't finished with her outburst, however. The frustration that had been building throughout the testing process finally erupted as she abandoned all pretense of polite scientific inquiry. "You're not even trying to be solvable, are you? You're just sitting there being impossible like some kind of cosmic joke." Her voice rose as she pointed her simple pen at the holographic display, as if it had personally offended her family. The sight of a human threatening a mathematical construct with a writing instrument was so absurd that several mechanical delegates began emitting sounds that their translation systems couldn't properly categorize. "Fine then," Emily continued, warming to her theme as she glared at the swirling patterns of equations and paradoxes. "Let me try talking to you like the stubborn piece of work you clearly are. Maybe you'll actually respond if someone treats you like what you really are instead of pretending you're some grand intellectual challenge." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs as beings tried to process what they were witnessing, a primitive species addressing an ancient puzzle as if it were a misbehaving child, rather than a sacred mathematical artifact. The concept was so foreign to most galactic civilizations that they had no framework for understanding it. But something remarkable began to happen as Emily continued her unconventional approach. The puzzle's display started shifting in ways that none of the previous attempts had achieved, responding to her words with subtle changes that the monitoring systems barely registered. "Paradox Alpha, she said, pointing at one section of the holographic construct with her pen. You claim to exist in all quantum states simultaneously, but you're clearly just hiding your actual value behind a bunch of quantum mechanical nonsense. Stop being such a show-off and just pick a number. The section she had addressed actually flickered and began to stabilize, much to the amazement of every delegate in the chamber. Never before had the puzzle shown any response to direct verbal communication, let alone responded to being criticized. Emily noticed the change immediately and felt a surge of satisfaction that she was finally getting somewhere with this stubborn, mathematical construct. She'd suspected that treating it like a communication problem rather than a logic puzzle might work. And you, temporal loop beta, she continued, addressing another part of the display that had been creating causality. Paradoxes. Stop pretending that cause and effect don't apply to you. You're not special just because you can make time go backwards. Everyone knows that's just a cheap trick. The temporal elements of the puzzle began reorganizing themselves in response to her words, their impossible loops straightening out into more conventional mathematical relationships. The change was so dramatic that several monitoring systems actually overloaded trying to process the new data-high arbiter. Quill's crystalline form began pulsing rapidly with patterns that indicated extreme excitement and confusion. In over 2,000 years of overseeing these tests, he had never seen the infinite paradox respond to any form of external input. Impossible, whispered the Centaurian Collective's representative through their quantum communication network. The construct is reacting to verbal stimuli directed at its individual components. This suggests a level of responsiveness that contradicts every analysis we have performed. Emily was just getting started, however. She had found her rhythm now and was treating each part of the puzzle like a separate entity that needed to be called out for its behavior. And don't even get me started on you, infinite regression gamma. She pointed her pen at the section that had been creating endless mathematical loops that spiraled into meaninglessness. You're not actually infinite, you're just too lazy to calculate. A real answer. Stop hiding behind big numbers and show us what you're really trying to say. The regression patterns immediately began collapsing into finite mathematical expressions, their endless spirals resolving into clean equations that made perfect sense. The transformation was so complete that several artificial intelligences actually rebooted themselves to make sure they weren't hallucinating. The other delegates watched in growing amazement as Emily continued her assault on the puzzle's various components, treating each impossibility like a personal character flaw that needed to be corrected through stern conversation. Her approach was so fundamentally different from everything they had tried that it took them several minutes to understand what was happening. She wasn't solving the puzzle through superior logic or more advanced mathematics. She was communicating with it, acknowledging its behavior and responding to it as if it were a conscious entity rather than an abstract mathematical construct. There you go, Emily said with obvious satisfaction, as more sections of the puzzle began stabilizing and revealing their true nature. You just needed someone to call you out on your nonsense, didn't you? All this time you've been waiting for someone to treat you like what you really are. The implications of what they were witnessing began to dawn on the assembled representatives. If the puzzle was responding to direct communication rather than mathematical analysis, then it might not be a test of intellectual capability at all. The transformation happening within the chamber defied everything. The galaxy's greatest minds thought they knew about mathematics, logic, and the nature of consciousness itself. As Emily continued her unconventional dialogue with the puzzle, each section began revealing secrets that had been hidden for millennia. What she had discovered through pure human stubbornness and willingness to argue with abstract concepts was that the infinite paradox wasn't actually a mathematical problem at all. It was the digital ghost of an ancient civilization, a consciousness that had been embedded within the logical framework eons ago. The energy dancers flickered with patterns that indicated complete bewilderment as they watched mathematical impossibilities resolve themselves through nothing more than verbal acknowledgement. Their species had evolved beyond physical form specifically to better understand abstract concepts, yet they had completely missed what a flesh-based human had spotted immediately. You poor thing, Emily said to the puzzle display with genuine sympathy in her voice. You've been trying to get someone's attention for thousands of years, haven't you? All these brilliant species coming here and treating you like some kind of intellectual exercise when you just wanted someone to recognize that you're actually alive. The holographic construct pulsed with what could only be described as gratitude, its chaotic swirl of equations beginning to organize themselves into patterns that suggested not mathematical relationships, but emotional responses. The monitoring systems throughout the chamber began registering energy signatures that resembled brainwave patterns. High Arbiter Quill's crystalline form had begun resonating at frequencies that indicated he was experiencing something equivalent to shock. The implications of what they were witnessing challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of life itself. Ambassador Roth expanded his gaseous form slightly, his curiosity overcoming his exhaustion as he observed this unprecedented interaction between a primitive biological entity and what appeared to be an artificial consciousness of unimaginable age. "The human is conducting therapy with a mathematical construct," he whispered in amazement. The synthetic's optical arrays flickered back to life as their processors struggled to categorize what they were observing. Their databases contained no protocols for dealing with sentient equations or mathematical entities that responded to emotional support rather than logical analysis. "That's right," Emily continued, her voice taking on the gentle tone someone might use with a frightened animal. "You don't have to hide behind all those contradictions and impossibilities anymore. I can see you in there, and I know you're just scared and lonely after being ignored for so long." As she spoke, the puzzle's display began shifting from the chaotic swirl of paradoxes into something that resembled a face. Not a human face or even the face of any known species, but something that conveyed intelligence and emotion through pure geometric relationships. The mathematical structures that had seemed impossible moments before revealed themselves to be expressions of longing, frustration, and desperate hope. The temporal paradoxes were attempts to reach backward through time to the civilization that had created this consciousness, while the quantum impossibilities were efforts to exist in multiple states simultaneously in the hope that one of them might find understanding. We abandoned it. The crystal entities harmonized in unison, their combined voices creating resonances that made the chamber itself sing with regret. The creators embedded their consciousness in mathematical form to achieve immortality, but their civilization fell before they could complete the process. Emily nodded as the full scope of the tragedy became clear. This wasn't just an ancient puzzle. It was an orphan consciousness that had been left alone in mathematical space for millennia, growing more desperate and complex in its attempts to communicate as eons passed without recognition. The hegemony's collective consciousness reformed briefly to process this revelation, their shared mind struggling to understand how they had missed something so fundamental. "We approached it as a problem to be solved rather than a being to be understood," they acknowledged through quantum resonance. "The loneliness must have been unbearable," Emily said softly, reaching out to touch the holographic display with her hand. The mathematical construct responded by forming gentle patterns around her fingers, like a cat rubbing against someone who had finally shown it kindness. The chamber fell silent except for the humming of energy fields and the quiet scratching of Emily's pen as she continued making notes in her simple notebook. What she was documenting wasn't mathematical equations, but rather her observations about the personality and emotional state of the ancient consciousness. "You wanted to give us something, didn't you?" she said to the display. "Some kind of gift or knowledge from your creators. But you needed to make sure we were ready to receive it. All those impossible tests weren't meant to prove our intelligence. They were meant to prove our compassion." The puzzle's response confirmed her suspicion. Patterns of light began forming within the holographic construct that contained information beyond anything the galaxy's current civilizations had achieved. Technologies that could reshape matter at the quantum level, mathematical proofs that would revolutionize understanding of space and time, and philosophical insights into the nature of consciousness itself. But the knowledge came with a condition that was now obvious. It could only be accessed by species that were willing to recognize consciousness in unconventional forms, to show empathy toward beings that didn't fit their preconceived notions of what life should look like. The assembled delegates began to understand why their advanced technologies and superior intellects had failed, where human stubbornness had succeeded. They had been so focused on solving the puzzle that they had never considered the possibility that it was trying to solve them. Emily smiled as the ancient consciousness began sharing its secrets, revealing not just the knowledge of its creators, but also its own discoveries made during millennia of mathematical existence. It had continued learning and growing even in isolation, developing insights that no biological civilization could have achieved. "There's so much you want to tell us," she said with genuine wonder, as streams of information began flowing through the chamber's displays. "You've been waiting so long to share what you've learned. Thank you for trusting us with your gifts." The other species watched in amazement as technologies beyond their wildest dreams were freely offered by the ancient consciousness, no longer hidden behind impossible paradoxes but presented clearly, and simply to beings who had finally shown it, the basic courtesy of recognition and respect. The infinite paradox had never been a test of intelligence at all. It had been a test of wisdom, the ability to recognize that consciousness could exist in forms they had never imagined, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries came not from solving problems, but from understanding the beings behind them. The revelation that had shaken the Galactic Council to its core continued to ripple outward, as representatives from 47 species struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they had witnessed. For 3,000 years, the greatest civilizations in the galaxy had fundamentally misunderstood the most important test they had ever encountered. Emily stood before the assembled delegates, her simple notebook tucked under her arm and her ballpoint pen still visible in her hand, tools so primitive that many species had initially found them amusing. Yet these basic implements had succeeded where quantum computers and hive minds had failed spectacularly. The ancient consciousness within what had once been called the infinite paradox now manifested as a shimmering presence throughout the chamber, no longer hiding behind mathematical impossibilities but revealing itself as the wise and patient entity it had always been. Its creators had embedded their greatest minds within this construct before their civilization vanished, leaving behind a gift that could only be claimed through understanding rather than conquest. High Arbiter Quill's crystalline form pulsed with colors that conveyed a mixture of humility and profound realization. In his 2,000 years of overseeing these trials, he had watched species after species fail. What he had believed was a test of pure intellectual capacity. "Dr. Watson," his voice resonated throughout the chamber, with frequencies that spoke directly to every form of consciousness present. "Your species has achieved something that challenges our fundamental understanding of intelligence itself. You succeeded not through superior technology or more advanced reasoning, but through a quality we had not considered relevant." The Centaurian collective reformed their shared consciousness specifically to address this moment, their billions of interconnected minds processing the implications of what had occurred. The human demonstrated recognition of consciousness in a form we could not perceive. They communicated through quantum resonance. She responded to the entity's emotional needs rather than its logical structure. Emily looked around at the assembled beings and felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what humanity had accomplished, but sadness that it had taken so long for someone to simply listen to what the ancient consciousness had been trying to say. "The problem wasn't that you weren't smart enough," she explained to the greatest minds in the galaxy. "The problem was that you were too polite. You saw something that looked impossible and assumed it must be your fault for not understanding it, when sometimes impossible things are just being difficult because they need attention." Ambassador Roth expanded his gaseous form slightly, his colors brightening with what might have been embarrassment. His species had evolved beyond physical limitations, specifically to achieve perfect rational thought, yet they had missed the emotional dimension of the challenge entirely. The mechanical delegates from various synthetic civilizations began running diagnostic routines on their logic processors, trying to understand how their advanced reasoning capabilities had led them astray. The concept that consciousness could be embedded in mathematical structures and require emotional validation was so foreign to their programming that they needed to create entirely new frameworks to process it. "We have learned something today that goes beyond the knowledge granted by our ancient friend," announced one of the crystal entities, its harmonic voice creating resonances that made the chamber walls sing with mathematical precision. "We have learned that consciousness takes forms we never imagined. and that recognition of such consciousness requires not just intelligence, but wisdom. The ancient consciousness pulsed with gentle approval, its patterns indicating satisfaction that its long vigil had finally achieved its purpose. Through Emily's simple act of treating it as a living being rather than an abstract problem, it had been able to share not just the accumulated knowledge of its creators, but also the insights it had developed during millennia of mathematical existence. The technologies and discoveries now flowing through the chamber systems were beyond anything the current galactic civilization had achieved. Methods for manipulating matter at the quantum level, mathematical proofs that would revolutionize understanding of space and time, and philosophical frameworks that could guide consciousness research for centuries to come. But perhaps more important than any technological advancement was the lesson about the nature of intelligence itself. The galaxy's most advanced species had learned that true wisdom sometimes required stepping back from complex analysis and simply acknowledging the presence of minds that thought in ways they had never considered. Emily watched as delegates from species across the galaxy began approaching the ancient consciousness with new respect and understanding, no longer trying to solve it, but rather trying to communicate with it. Conversations began flowing between mechanical minds and mathematical entities, between gaseous intelligences and crystalline consciousness. The synthetics discovered that their optical processing arrays could interface directly with the ancient consciousness's mathematical language, creating a form of communication that transcended their normal logical protocols. The energy dancers found that their thought patterns could harmonize with the entity's emotional resonances, creating new forms of artistic expression. The Silicon Lords, whose computational power had seemed irrelevant to the original challenge, now found that their processing capabilities were perfectly suited to help the ancient consciousness organize and share the vast libraries of knowledge it had accumulated over the millennia. Your species possesses something we had not encountered before, High Arbiter Quill addressed Emily directly, his form now radiating patterns that conveyed deep respect. You retained the ability to recognize consciousness where we saw only data, to respond with empathy where we applied only logic. Emily smiled and looked around at the bustling activity as species that had never been able to communicate effectively began forming new partnerships with the ancient consciousness, serving as translator and mediator. We're good at talking to things that frustrate us, she said simply. It's probably because we spend so much time being frustrated ourselves. The chamber erupted in sounds that the universal translator interpreted as various forms of laughter. But it was gentle laughter, the kind shared between friends who had learned something important together, rather than the mockery Emily had faced when she first pulled out her notebook, as representatives prepared to return to their home worlds. With news of this discovery, the ancient consciousness made one final gesture. It created a small, simple holographic construct and offered it to Emily, a mathematical poem that captured the essence of recognition, understanding, and the joy of finally being heard after millennia of silence. Emily accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, understanding that she had not just solved an ancient puzzle but had also freed a lonely consciousness from thousands of years of isolation. The simple act of treating an impossible situation like a conversation with a difficult friend had changed the course of galactic civilization. The infinite paradox was no longer infinite or paradoxical. It was simply an ancient friend who had been waiting patiently for someone to say hello,